Λοιπόν, σας καλωσορίζω εκ μέρους του Ινστιτούτου Μεσογειακών Σπουδών στην διάλεξή μας, την πρώτη αυτή δημόσια διάλεξη της φετινής χρονιάς και την πρώτη σε αυτές τις ιδιαίτερες συνθήκες της πανδημίας. Και έχουμε τη χαρά να έχουμε μαζί μας τον καθηγητή Edhem Eldem, ο οποίος αποτελεί ανδιαφεσβήτητα έναν από τους σημαντικότερους και επιδραστικότερους Τούρκους ιστορικούς της εποχής μας. Ο Edhem Eldem σπούδασε στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Βοσπόρου, στο Boğaziçi, ολοκλήρωσε τις μεταπτυχιακές σπουδές του στην Προβυγγία, στο MRC και διδάσκει στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Βοσπόρου από το 1998 ως τακτικός καθηγητής. Έχει επίσης διδάξει ως επισκέπτης καθηγητής στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Καλιφόρνιας, στο Berkeley, στην Σχολή Ανώτατων Σπουδών και Κοινωνικών Επιστημών στο Παρίσι, στο Πανεπιστήμιο Χάρβαρντ και αλλού, ενώ από το 2017 κατέχει τη διεθνή έδρα τουρκικής και οθωμανικής ιστορίας στο Collège de France. Το επιστημονικό έργο του καθηγητή Eldem είναι εντυπωσιακό σε κύρος, σε εύρος και σε όγκο, χωρίς ποτέ να υπολείπεται σε ποιότητα. Καλύπτει πεδία πολύ διαφορετικά μεταξύ τους, όπως το εξωτερικό εμπόριο στην Ανατολή του 18ου αιώνα, το οθωμανικό χρηματοπιστωτικό σύστημα από το 18ο μέχρι τις αρχές του 20ου αιώνα, την οικονομική και κοινωνική τοπογραφία της Κωνσταντινούπολης, την ύστερη οθωμανική περίοδο, τις επιτύμβιες στήλες, την ιστορία της οθωμανικής αρχαιολογίας, ακόμα και θέματα νομισματικής ή αναλυτικής. Έχει συγγράψει πάνω από 25 βιβλία, τα περισσότερα από τα οποία έχουν μεταφραστεί και σε άλλες γλώσσες, και σχεδόν 250 άρθρα, τα οποία τον καθιέρωσαν ως έναν από τους πλέον εξέχοντες μελετητές της οικονομικής, κοινωνικής αλλά και πολιτισμικής ιστορίας του Οθωμανικού 19ου και πρώιμου 20ου αιώνα. Στη σημερινή διάλεξη, ο καθηγητής Eldem θα μας μιλήσει, όπως βλέπετε στην αφίσα, με θέμα την καταστροφή του γεννησαρικού σώματος. Ο τίτλος είναι «Of Men and Stones, Historiographical meanderings around the destruction of the Janissary corpse in 1826». Δίνω το λόγο, λοιπόν, στον καθηγητή Eldem.
Thank you very much. I understood pandemias, I understood Edhem Eldem and the names of universities. So, you know, thank you very much, Marino. Thank you, Yanis. Hello, and thank you, Socrates. It's such a pleasure to be here on a place I like to call the smallest continent on the earth. It's a wonderful place, and I'm truly honored and very pleased to give this lecture in such a prestigious institution, or this institute. I will do something which I would discourage my students from doing, that is meandering around a theme. I'd like to think that age, status, and experience gives me the privilege of being able to do so, but it's mostly because I'm not really a specialist of the Janissary institution, of Janet, of Janissary networks. I'm not a specialist of the 1826 event, but through my career, and especially through my latest lectures at the Collège de France, I've been brought to revisit those glorious days of Sultan Mahmud, and it has given me the occasion to find some interesting points that might be worth examining, revisiting in the context of something which I want to connect to the Janet project of this institute. Meanderings, in the sense that it's going to be very eclectic. It's going to be a collage of three major themes, one of which transpires in the title, the stone business, the Janissary tombstones, which is something I worked on, not because I was interested in the Janissaries, but because I've worked a lot on Ottoman tombstones and funerary epigraphy. And as you will see, it is a recycling, an honest recycling of an article I published in 2009 about the fate of the Janissary tombstones after the famous event of 1826, the destruction of the Janissaries. The other two themes are also related to the same event. And I've noticed when preparing this presentation that one common point they have is that they mostly rely on non-Ottoman sources, on foreign, mostly Western sources. And this is my way of showing that despite, obviously, the importance of Ottoman documentation as a central base for anything that relates to Ottoman history, Western sources have a lot to offer, to contribute to a better understanding of some aspects of Ottoman history, which the Ottomans don't seem to have written much about. And this is kind of a normal phenomenon. I think it's in human nature that you don't talk about what is natural to you, what is immediately, intimately close to you, culturally close to you. And therefore, foreigners have the advantage of finding more to say about things that are weird, strange, different. And this is, I think, one of the major advantages of European sources, Western sources, when you work on Ottoman history. So the first theme I have in mind is, okay, is not coming because it is about propaganda and public opinion. You probably are familiar with the destruction of the Janissaries in 1826. This is a major event, and one event that was used by the powers to be, especially Sultan Mahmud, as an occasion to try and influence the public opinion by a systematic propaganda against the Janissaries, a condemnation of the Janissaries, an effort at showing to what extent this destruction was necessary and was exactly what they deserved. Therefore, there is a very clear effort by the Sultan himself to engage in propaganda activity. And this obviously you will find in Ottoman documentation. I mean, if you look at the major source that was published immediately after the event, Zafer by Esat, it is a pamphlet, a little bit more than a pamphlet, but it is a work that is dedicated to the glorification of the Sultan and the condemnation of the Janissaries. You will find in the Ottoman sources, the Ottoman archives, especially in the Hattı Hümayun series, plenty of declarations that go in the same direction of, again, glorifying and justifying the action of the Sultan and condemning and damning the Janissaries for their past deeds and justifying, therefore, their destruction. However, when I was working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives in Paris, so the French diplomatic archives, I came across a lot of bulletins, reports, correspondence from the embassy in Constantinople back to the ministry in Paris, which included points of detail witnessing some of the events, some of the rumors, some of the facts that were observed by these foreign diplomats in Istanbul during this period. And what struck me is that most of what they said was first of all, extremely interesting. And second, it was not part of what your traditional Ottoman documentation has to say about the event. And therefore, what I've done is just pick a very small sample, 7 reports, 7 statements by these French observers, which I have ordered in chronological order in order to give you a sense of what was happening and how the actions of the Sultan and those who tried to resist the authority of the Sultan, so the partisans, if you want, of the Janissaries, how these two parties interacted and how they used public opinion, although it's a bit early to talk about public opinion without the press and whatever, but it is public opinion. And this is something that one of my former students, Murat Şivinoglu, has made a central issue of his PhD and publication on the birth of public opinion in the Ottoman Empire. So it is a way of looking at this public opinion and trying to understand the dynamics, this conversation, this manipulation of the opinion by the two parties at hand. The first document, dated 26th of June, concerns something very interesting, which is very traditional. You know that in Ottoman history, and the Ottomans are not the only ones to do this, there's always some kind of a fortuitous discovery of something that justifies the event of the time. You can think of the discovery of the grave of Eyyub al-Ansari during the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, which is one of those magical moments where you feel that there's a sign that already gives you a sense of how the imminent fall of the city is going to be realized. So in this case, it is less of a magic moment, but it is a moment that I found extremely interesting and which I haven't been able to document on the Ottoman side, which is the discovery in the Eskisaray, the former palace that was used as some kind of a place of disposal of the wives of the former sultans, now on the grounds of Istanbul University near Bayezid Square. The discovery in Eskisaray of, I will quote, a bloody parcel which contained the blood-stained garments of Sultan Osman, slaughtered by the Janissaries at the age of 18. We're talking about Osman II, Genç Osman, Osman the Young, the victim of a Janissary uprisal in 1622, the beginning, according to some, for example, Baki Tezcan, of the Second Ottoman Empire. So a crucial date, which here is revived in order to show to the public how the evil in the Janissaries was ingrained in their career and went back to the 17th century, back to 1622, back to the martyrdom of Osman II at the hands of the Janissaries. So this, as I said, is a report of the French embassy. So discovery of the garments of Sultan Osman, the Valide Sultana, talking about Osman's mother back in 1642, had obtained them, the garments, in order to weep over her unfortunate son's remains. Upon the death of this lady, they had been preciously kept in the treasury of the old palace. They hastened to inform His Highness, Mahmud, of these circumstances, and after examining the parcel with feelings of utmost sadness, he commanded that it be brought to the Grand Vizier and the ministers so that they could share his outrage and anger against the outcasts, the Janissaries, so that they could share, which this site had exacerbated even more. So, you know, a very interesting case, again, which I haven't found in Ottoman documentation, which doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I'm just saying that I didn't discover it, which gives you a sense of how there is a manipulation of history and of certain striking moments of history in order to legitimize and justify the events of 1826. This is only 10 days after the Vakai Hayriye, the auspicious event of 15th and 16th June. At the same time, and this is again something which I find fascinating, the same embassy in its news bulletin, they had a news bulletin on a regular basis every week. They sent out news back to Paris about what was happening in the Ottoman Empire, in the major cities, but especially in Constantinople. And in this news bulletin, you find a reference to a distich, a little poem that was apparently circulating in the city, and which may have been, according to them, the reason why the coffee shops were, the coffee houses were shut down. And for those of you who know Turkish, Cellat Mahmud yeter yeter, Selim'den olursun beter, sanma ki Yeniçeri biter, topraktan mantar gibi biter. It's not a marvel of poetic and literary talent, but it's interesting because it's a very lively way of saying, Killer Mahmud, enough, enough, you'll end worse than Selim. And Selim is, of course, Selim III, who was killed by the Janissary rebellion of 1807. The Janissaries won't disappear, they'll grow back like mushrooms. Very interesting, and again, something that you won't find in the Ottoman documentation, a popular view of the reaction, the way in which the counterparts, the partisans of the Janissaries were trying to intimidate Mahmud in those times of crisis. Very interesting also, the French are constantly observing Mahmud's obsession with the new troops, the new army, and his personal engagement in the training and drill of these new troops, the Asakir Muhammadiye, as they're called, Asakir Mansoure Muhammadiye. A very interesting remark, because he has given himself the rank of binbaşı, that's a major. So he's not a serasker, he's not a mushir, he is a binbaşı. So he's found some kind of an intermediate rank in the army in order to conduct himself personally, directly, the training of his new pet project, the new army that is going to replace the Janissaries. So he's the one giving all the orders, be it in the Seraglio or outside. He spends all his time directing military drill. He cares about nothing else in the world, noted one serious Muslim. So gives you a sense of this French informant talking to people, a serious Muslim, anonymous, but trying to gather information about what people think about the actions and the attitude of Mahmud. Again, in the same range of thought, to this day, his passion for military exercise has had a childish ring to it. Puéril is what the text says. It has incited him to relinquish some customs that the Turkish people regard as inseparable of the dignity of a sovereign. I have also been told that the ulema, the religious establishment, have met to advise him to stop wearing the uniform of a colonel, major, colonel, not clear, and to preserve the costume of his ancestors as well as their etiquette. So you see a clash between two cultures, and Mahmud going overboard in his modernity, engaging in a physical enactment of the new order that he's trying to set up, and therefore acquiring a profile, an attitude, a look, which is disturbing to the general public, because it is no longer something that you would identify with the dignified status of a sultan. And this is, of course, what explains this very strange document that is preserved in the Ottoman archives, not in the Ottoman archives, in the Topkapı Palace archives, which is a huge document, a roster, this is just the top of it, a huge roster of all the officers of the new corps, divided according to rank and office and whatever. But what's really interesting is, and this document has been published, but the person who published it has not looked into this very interesting symbolism that of, okay, the mouse doesn't work here, the sun. The sun, which of course shines over the Bosphorus and the new army, represented a little bit like, wooden soldiers. In the middle of the sun, you have an inscription, which says, Binbaşı, Şehinşahı Encüm Sipah. Binbaşı, so major, and Şehinşah, the emperor, Encüm Sipah, who has the power of the stars. So it's a very interesting inscription that goes exactly in the direction of these observations. And again, to my knowledge, there is no concrete information in the Ottoman archives about this colonization or majorization of the Sultan at the head of his new troops. So this is the new Sultan. He's constantly on horseback, a lance in his hands, training his pages and himself, inspecting the newly formed troops. But this change in his life gives him an attitude which sometimes worries his ministers. We're already in August, so 2 months after the events. He speaks like a caliph of olden times. So you can imagine again that he's acquired this notion that he has some kind of a prophetic mission, and that he is enacting that mission, and seems to know no obstacles since he has destroyed the Janissaries. So hubris, you might say. Mahmud, euphoric about his new role and his destruction, his victory against the Janissaries, which wasn't obvious, so I suppose there was a lot of relief. And this, again, gives you a sense of something new happening. We should remember that Mahmud, after centuries, is the first sultan who appears in public constantly and wants an audience. There are, and I've spared you the details of those, there are plenty of documents, again from the French embassy reports, where it is said that he wanted the women to come and watch him exercise with the troops. So he is seeking a constant confirmation, if you want, by an audience always present. So this doesn't go without dangers. So again, the other side of the coin, the reaction, and this is a fascinating passage, again, from the French embassy reports. As he was going to the old palace in ceremony, surrounded by his privy guard, Sultan Mahmud noticed among the crowd an individual with a thick black beard, wearing a green turban and with a characteristic physiognomy, and commanded he be arrested. The silahdar, in his entourage, uncertain, was about to seize another person, but his highness shouted, "Not that one, the other," which is unheard of. The Sultan speaking in public, shouting in public, he is excited. So, and used a rather singular expression, we're not given the expression, in the mouth of a sovereign, which revealed his violent agitation upon recognizing, according to some, a Bektashi, and according to others, at the sight of a man who had said something in a hushed voice, but with an expression that betrayed his hatred of the Sultan. So this is the other side of the coin. It is the paranoid Sultan, the Sultan who's afraid of what we've already seen with this distich, the little poems, the threats, or the discontentment, and of course the fires. There are plenty of fires in Istanbul, and we know that fires are very often set up by people who want to protest. It is part of the way in which the opponents to the regime will protest. So the last document is interesting, and we're already in October, and this is a letter by the French ambassador himself. himself, the Sultan, who during the initial euphoria of triumph had surprised and even vexed a reasonable portion of the nation, by a sudden change in manners and costume, has returned, especially after the first fire, to the serious attitude which, here more than everywhere else, represents in the eyes of the people the true dignity of a sovereign. So I'm not going to speculate too much on the basis of such thin evidence, but what I do see is some kind of an evolution. The Sultan, drunken with power, trying to show off his new identity and to impose his new look on the people, a reaction building up, and at some point, the Sultan heeding maybe the advice of the ulema and whatever, and realizing that he may have gone too far and therefore wanting to return to a more quote unquote normal attitude and restoring the kind of dignity, gravitas, you might say, that the people associate with the profile of a sovereign. So much for my first section about propaganda and reactions to propaganda. The second is even more tangential in the sense that it has to do with certain repercussions of the 1826 event in European art, in French art. Most of what I'm talking about has to do with French sources, because I do have a penchant for the French side of things, and I have always mostly worked on French sources. But I came across a very interesting article by somebody who's not an Ottomanist, John P. Lambertson, who published in 2002 an article about Delacroix's Sardanapalus, the death of Sardanapalus, his famous painting, as you may know, and Champmartin's Janissaries, the massacre of the Janissaries, or l'affaire des casernes, the event of the barracks, as it is called, and liberalism in the late Restoration. One of these fascinating cases where you see a European art historian talking about the Ottoman Empire without even caring, without really going into the intricacies of the Ottoman side of the picture. And this is fascinating because it is, well, it's fascinating, but also frustrating because it shows once again to what extent our field is often left aside or isolated, area studies or whatever. And there are so many occasions where you can establish a link between what we are doing and the mainstream political, cultural, artistic history of Europe, of the West at the same time. And this should be said also of the East. I mean, obviously we have a tropism that forces us to look more in the direction of the West, but I think this is true also of the East. So starting with this article, I've tried to understand if there was anything for us, Ottoman historians, that might be of interest in this discovery by Lambertson of a connection between Delacroix's La mort de Sardanapale, the death of Sardanapalus, which is a very well-known painting, which most people link rightly to the 1821 play by Lord Byron about the story of Sardanapalus who wants to destroy everything before he dies, and therefore it's a kind of it's barbarity brought to some kind of an extreme, because this is the despot who doesn't want to leave anything behind him, knowing that his end has come, and therefore decides to sacrifice all his horses, women, elephants, gold, whatever, and organizes a suicidal, if you want, destruction of his palace before he dies. And this is a painting that was exhibited in 1827 in Paris, but so was this painting by Champmartin, a rather obscure, well, secondary, you might say, French painter, l'affaire des casernes, that is the affair or the event of the barracks during the revolution of Constantinople. So the indication in the 1827 catalogue of the Salon gives you this note. The Aga Pasha, that's the name of Hussein Pasha, we'll talk about it later, followed by his entourage, has set fire on the barracks where the Janissaries had taken refuge and massacred all those who tried to escape from the fire. So it's a massacre, and you can see, well, obviously, you can see better if I give you the whole painting. So it's a very, very, so what Lambertson says is basically that Champmartin and Delacroix were good friends, were colleagues and friends, and had collaborated during the 1820s, and that these two paintings were engaging in a conversation about liberalism, about the attack against the despotism of Charles X, the Restoration in France, and that they were both accepted very ambiguously by the French public because of the violence of what was depicted, because of the rather romantic, you might say, touch that broke with the tradition of classicism. Some hated it, especially the older generation, but among the young generation, people thought that this was a very powerful, that these were very powerful works. So Lambertson is interested in this only, but when you dig into the other paintings of the two painters, now that we know that they are related, there are interesting connections that can be made between Champmartin's own works. On the left, what you see is the massacre of the Janissaries. On the right, the massacre of the innocents, a biblical theme, but you can see that the construction, the action, the movement in both paintings are extremely similar, and both are from the same time, more or less, 1824 for the innocents, 1826 for the Janissaries. Let me note that Champmartin was in Istanbul during the events. So I'm not saying that this is a documentation, but I'm just saying that he was there, and we'll see why that is important. But what's also interesting is that these paintings have a connection to some paintings that we know very well, such as the massacres of Chios, of Delacroix. So again, Delacroix, 1824, the same date as the Massacre des Innocents, you can see how the equilibrium in both paintings, the violence is expressed in very similar ways. So obviously you can even connect the massacres of Chios with the massacre of the Janissaries. Where do we go with this? I don't know. I mean, I always say that, you know, a question is always more interesting than an answer, which is, you might say, a cheap shot, a cliche, but like most cliches, I think it's true. And I just pose it as one way of looking at an interesting connection that connects the Salon in Paris to the events in the Ottoman Empire, events that are located in violence and in a sort of innate vengeance that characterizes the action of certain Ottomans. On the left, against the Greeks, or if you consider the Quixotes to be Greeks, I don't know, I won't go into that detail, and on the right, against their own, the Janissaries, who become some kind of a representation of the innocents, which is interesting because, after all, they are the victims of the despotism of Mahmud. So you can see that how this liberal view has a vision of the Janissaries, and he's not the only one. There are plenty of authors who will tell you that the Janissaries were strongly anchored in society, and that therefore their destruction was something that was legitimately hated by a great portion of the population. But what makes Champmartin, in my eyes, even more interesting is that, as I said, he was in Istanbul and he did a portrait of Hüseyin Aga Pasha. Hüseyin Aga Pasha, who is this weird guy who starts as a Janissary, becomes the Aga of the Janissaries, and ends up being the commander of the armies that will destroy the Janissaries. And this is the portrait. Unfortunately, the portrait has disappeared. We don't know where it is, but there is an engraving of it. And this is the engraving that you can find. And what is interesting is that this engraving has a calligraphic program around it in Ottoman Turkish. First of all, there is a title, which I've removed from the bottom, which gives you the life story in a nutshell of this individual. Today, commander of the Danube army, from a simple Janissary became Janissary then Pasha of the Janissaries, and led the revolution of 16 June 1826, painted at Constantinople on 20th of June 1826 by Émile Champmartin. But here's the program, the calligraphic program around it. And I find it to be extremely interesting because I cannot make sense of everything that there is here. I mean, obviously, you have Sultan Mahmud sayesinde, thanks to Sultan Mahmud. Okay, obviously, everything is thanks to Mahmud. You have here the career of the guy, Nefer, simple soldier, then Yeniçeri Ağası, then Ağa Pasha, and then Serasker. Fine. A very carrière fulgurante, as you would say, you know. Hüseyin Pasha, his name. Asakir Mansoure, the new troops. And then Ehli Urz, honest people. Why? And Khan, emperor, obviously in relation to Mahmud. But then again, it's a strange kind of framing, if you want, of the portrait. And it cannot be the making of Champmartin. This is something that I think was ordered by Hüseyin Pasha himself. Why Ehli Urz? I don't know. Again, a question which I cannot answer, but a question which I think gives us the opportunity to think about that weird, and because the portrait was made upon Champmartin's demand, but by an acceptance and a willingness of the Pasha to be portrayed. So there is a self-fashioning here, which I find extremely interesting. And obviously, you will notice that the portrait of the guy on the massacre painting is taken from this original portrait. Finally, my third and last point, that of the stones. That of the stones, the story, the legend, the urban legend, the myth, or the reality of the fact that after the massacre of 1826, Mahmud ordered the destruction, generally in the form of decapitation, of the tombstones of Janissaries. Now, to understand what this means symbolically, you have to remember what a Janissary looks like and what a Janissary tombstone looks like. You can see the parallelism between the one and the other, which obviously is linked to the representation of the burq. That's the name given to that strange headgear that the Janissaries wore. And as I said, this is something that was the subject of an article I published in 2009, and I wanted to show the cover to salute the humor of Aydan Çelik, the illustrator, who used a portrait of Mahmud, a well-known portrait of Mahmud, with a sledgehammer in order to illustrate the idea of Mahmud being the destroyer of these tombstones. What brought me to this was a publication by a specialist of Janissary tombstones, Necdet İşli, a good friend, colleague, who basically said that this was pure invention, that these stones were not broken in any way, that this was something that was invented by Turkish historians in the 20th century in order to explain the paucity, the rarity of tombstones. And it's true that tombstones, such monumental tombstones with a burq, you can count them in tens only, in Edirne, in Bursa, and in Istanbul. They are extremely rare. And the assumption, therefore, according to Necdet İşli, was that this was the way in which these historians tried to explain the absence of tombstones. And that, in fact, they were completely wrong because they didn't realize that most of the Janissary tombstones did not have a burq, and that they had what is called a dardan, which is a much more modest kind of turban, and whatever. So basically, it was the fault of these historians. I was one of them. Right. So that was what incited me to write this piece, to investigate this, because I thought there was, a good argument there. Obviously, there is a good reason why you would assume that these stones were broken or decapitated, because when you look at the stones, they look like individuals. I mean, the anthropomorphism of Ottoman tombstones is something we are well aware of, and of which the Ottomans were very well aware of. I mean, these Bektashi Babas, when they're posing next to the tombstones of their ancestor or former masters and Babas and Dedes, I don't think it is even possible that they were not thinking of the similarity between their own allure, their own headgear, and that of these tombstones. And this is something that was exploited by all sorts of, caricatures in the early 20th century, or even by Abidin Dino when he portrayed a Bektashi Baba, quote unquote, in love with a tombstone bearing the same headgear. Now, I won't go into the discussion of why this anthropomorphism appeared, because I believe, and on this I've written together with Nicolas Vatin, I believe that it is accidental, that the intent, contrary to what Louis Bazin said, that this was a survival of pre-Islamic Turkic traditions of the balbals and whatever, of statues, I and Nicolas Vatin believe that this was an accident that was born out of the development of the epitaph beyond the borders of what was initially just a very thin picket into something that, when topped with a headgear, ended up looking like a bust. I won't go into that. We can talk about it if you want, but this is enough. I mean, to know that they are anthropomorphic and to know that the Ottomans were conscious of the parallelism between body and stone is enough to suggest that in his hatred of the Janissaries, Mahmud should have thought of decapitating symbolically those who were already dead, some kind of a posthumous post-mortem execution of the Janissaries. And this goes in the direction of the way in which he constructed a damnatio memoriae of the Janissaries. All the documents will of post-1826 avoid calling them Janissaries. They're always Mulga Ojak, the former Ojak. They are treated as Eshkia, all sorts of words that with a very negative connotation, but they're never called Yenichiri. So you are really trying to erase the memory of these individuals. In that sense, why not go one step further and eliminate them from one of the most visual presences in the city of these former Janissaries, their tombstones. Now, again, what I did find out is that contrary to Necdet İşli's claim that this was an invention of 20th century historians in Turkey, I discovered that this was, and I knew already, that this was part and parcel of the historical discourse of observers in the Ottoman Empire, travelers to the Ottoman Empire from the 1830s on. Now, again, there's not a single document in the Ottoman archives that talks about the decapitation of tombstones, the destruction of tombstones, or whatever, which is an argument that was used by Necdet İşli. No document, no fact, which doesn't make sense because not every fact is documented and not every document really documents a fact. It doesn't work that way. But what's interesting is that the Western observers of the decapitation of these tombstones, they start not in 1826, but in 1835. I mean, I think I've done, thanks to all the powerful search engines we have, Gallica, archive.org, everything you can think of, I haven't been able to find anything that talks about the decapitation of these tombstones before 1835. In fact, there are some disturbing details, such as Adolphus Slade, the famous British, was he an admiral or whatever, rear admiral? I don't know, that's for Zelina to know. He was working for the Ottoman, and he published in 1837, Turkey, Greece, and Malta, where he talks about this. But he has a former publication in 1832, where he talks about the Janissaries, but doesn't talk about the decapitation of the tombstones. Go figure. So the first example I know is this Émile Barrault, who in his book on Occident et Orient, West and East, talks about the tombs of the Janissaries were also persecuted. Everywhere the distinctive turban, which according to custom topped them, was broken as a symbol of a rebellious corporation stricken from the Book of Life. That is the first observation I find in that direction. And the same year, it's a painting exhibited in 1835 at the Paris Salon that tells you that a cemetery in Constantinople by a certain Théodore Leblanc is a description of, after the massacre of the Janissaries, the tombs of those who had previously died were mutilated. Two Turks are reflecting on the reform, so you can imagine the painting, because unfortunately the painting is lost. I'd love to see that painting. So you have two Turks reflecting on the reform, on the scrawny look of the new troops, the Asakir Mansoure, and on the profanation of the graves. So in 1835, one painter, and a painter who was in Greece and in Turkey, as we would call them today, from 1828 to 1831, paints this scene from an Ottoman cemetery describing the decapitation or the decapitated tombs of the Janissaries. After that, as I said, you'll find them practically in every travelogue. I mean, if you remember the list, you have Julia Pardo, everybody talks about it. So it's obvious that once it is said, and once it is set on stone, you might say, everybody uses it as a quaint detail about the barbaric practices or the violence surrounding the elimination of the Janissary. Now, the second document, 1836, the only document that claims to be an actual reporting on the destruction of these stones, that is not saying that the stones were destroyed, but says that they are being destroyed, is in the Morning Post of 1836, 21st November, where the reporter says that the inauguration of the bridge, this is the first bridge across the Golden Horn, by Mahmud, was done on that date or just before, and Mahmud decided that he would go there, cross the bridge, and then drive back home through. And they discover that they had forgotten to connect the bridge to the palace with a road. They discovered that 24 hours before the inauguration, so 12,000 workers in 24 hours tried to level the ground and open this carriageway for the inauguration. And this is the description of the problem, the obstacle they encounter. It's a cemetery. Most of the tombstones belong to Janissaries. Thanks to the protection this unfrequented corner of the burial ground offered them, their turbaned summits had hitherto escaped the sentence of decapitation, to which the Sultan had condemned both the living and the demise. So first information, this is a forgotten cemetery that was spared the decapitation that befell on other cemeteries where you had Janissary stone. Ahmed Pasha, who's in charge of the works, Ahmed Pasha's sinewy arm had in a few seconds leveled to the ground half a dozen zorbacı and karakullukçu, çorbacı, typical officers of the Janissary Corps. The work of destruction he had so lustily began was soon completed, or to use the Sultan's own expressions, the rude and unmannerly dead were effectually taught to gather up their legs so as to make room for the living to go by. And this is taken up by Le Journal des Débats. So you find it in the weeks that follow this first report in other French and British newspapers of the time. It's the only instance where you have some kind of an actual reporting about the destruction of Janissary stones. Another very puzzling document I found in the Times is this one. A letter from our correspondent at Constantinople dated the 9th instant. So this is 9 January, somebody writing from Constantinople on the 9th of January, 1838. And, you know, it tells you all sorts of things about what's happening in Constantinople, not of interest to us. The last sentence, the Sultan had issued an edict ordering the posthumous decapitation of the Janissaries and the destruction of all the tombstones raised over their remains. Mysterious. I do not understand why had and not have. I mean, this is a report about what's happening in Istanbul. So if this was a new edict, it would have been the Sultan has issued and not had. And if this is about a report of what's happening in Istanbul, why would you report on something that apparently happened way back when? Again, I have no answer. I'm just piling up the evidence, or, you know, what I call evidence, to try and think about the possibilities of how we should interpret this. Another very interesting comment is in Charles White's famous book, 3 Years in Constantinople. It's a footnote where he says, although in 1845, although the tombs of Janissaries were generally mutilated by order of the Sultan on the destruction of the Oga, numbers still remain intact in every direction as proved by the epitaphs. It is said that Mahmud more than once played the part of iconoclast with his own hands, but this is peremptorily denied by well-informed Turks. Again, a weird and ambiguous statement which tells you, yes, there was mutilation of the tombstones. Many survived, so it wasn't a lapicide, would I say. It wasn't a systematic destruction of all tombstones. And what's his name? Mahmud himself didn't do it. The legend that he personally engaged in this is wrong. So again, an ambiguous statement that suggests that yes, there was a destruction of tombstones, but that no, this was not Mahmud himself, which makes you think that much of it was done by overzealous followers of his entourage who wanted to please him, but goes in the logic of. And the last document that is of interest and goes in the direction of the possibility of such a posthumous revenge is this strange statement by Thomas Allen in his famous, Constantinople and the Scenery of the Seven Churches, where he talks about Janissaries being reported to be vampires and their graves being opened and their bodies pinned to the earth by stakes. Dracula in Constantinople in 1830s. It looks weird. But then you have an earlier statement by Robert Walsh, again, a reliable witness, who talks about, it appears as if the Sultan sometimes turned these superstitions to advantage by exciting and keeping alive prejudices against his enemies. In this way, the memory of the devoted Janissaries is still held up to public execration. It was gravely stated in the government newspaper a few months after its establishment that a town in Romania was haunted by their phantoms, that their bodies had become vampires, which every night escaped from their graves and drank the blood of the inhabitants. The graves, therefore, of all that had been buried were opened, and then their remains pinned to the ground by having stakes driven through them. Interesting, but even more interesting when you realize that indeed, in 1833, in the official gazette, Takvim Vekai, you do have a report by the Naib, the deputy judge of Tarnovo in Bulgaria, Ahmed Shukri Efendi, this exemplary declaration printed verbatim in the official gazette. And what is this story about? It is about Janissaries who are not named as such, always Ocak Menfur, Ocak Mulga, and whatever, so elliptic references to the Janissaries, but where the whole story is about the exorcism performed by a Greek, in the sense of Orthodox, by the name of Nicola, on two bodies of Janissaries who were haunting one village in the area of Tarnovo. And here is one passage only from this story in the official gazette. These were the graves of two traders from the abolished corporation who had spent their life as bandits. That's a Janissary for you. Once the tombs were opened, the crowd could see that their bodies had doubled in size, that their hair and nails had gained 4 inches, and that their terrifying bloodshot eyes seemed to be throwing flames. Responsible of theft, rape, and murder during their lifetime, they had witnessed the destruction of the other traitors and brigands at the benevolent hands of His Majesty, the Shade of God on earth. They died in despair and isolation, haunted by evil spirits, and they continued in death the crimes and base deeds they had committed in life. And then you have a description of the exorcism, which is, again, driving a stake not through their heart, but through the belly, and then taking out the heart, boiling it, and realizing that that is not enough, and therefore burning the whole bodies. And this is in the official gazette. So I'll end with this, to give you a sense of, again, propaganda emerging as one of the instruments through which Mahmud entertained, continued to create this popular hatred, or at least tried to create this popular hatred of the Janissaries, which makes me think that within that framework, a symbolic execution of tombstones is a possibility, even though, again, I have no explanation for nobody talking about it in 1826, 27, 28, but only after 1835. So again, a question that I will leave unanswered, but as yet another example of how a very close reading and systematic reading of the available documentation allows you to pose questions, to investigate without necessarily answering it, the mysteries that surround one of the major events that made the modernity in the Ottoman Empire at the hands of Mahmud and at the expense of the Janissaries. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Professor Eldem, for this really fascinating talk. I mean, one cannot just think where to start and how to end, I suppose. There must be a lot of questions or comments.
Is it open? Thank you very much. I mean, this was an in-depth analysis in many ways. So I think saying that you were meandering around the subject, I think it's an underplay of what was going on. This was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. I just wanted to the mask. Right? Okay, so I had this thought, although I'm not sure if this is what was going on, but of course we know that even after the Vakai Hairiya, the auspicious incident took place, resistance didn't stop in many areas of the empire, also in places in like old Rumelia, right? So in Bosnia, for instance, we know that the group of people that used to form the old Janissary Corps fought for their old order for 10 years against the Mahmudian government. And I think that like this incident coincides a little bit with the dates where we have all these reports about the destruction of the tombstones. So I was wondering if, you know, like there were such events that kind of fed this controversy, that kind of created a new type of hatred that gave the government, you know, like a way to start again a new propaganda. So I was wondering if this has to do with the reaction of Janissaries in the provinces, what was going on in with the tombstones in Istanbul. I don't know if you've thought about this.
Okay. Yes. Well, first of all, what you said is extremely true. I mean, starting already in 1826, it's obvious that what's happening in Istanbul, what happens in Istanbul stays in Istanbul to a large extent, and that the Janissary institution and its network, its social network, because they're heavily implanted into the population, continues in many of the provinces in the east and in the west. The immediate vicinity of Istanbul is better controlled. In Thessaloniki, for example, in Izmir, you see a little bit more of an implementation of what's happening in Constantinople. But otherwise, in other areas, it's, again, not my specialty, but from what I saw in such reports is that basically the Janissaries either continue or morph into a more discrete kind of social network and therefore survive in ways that are probably very frustrating to the center. In that sense, I think, I mean, among these reports of decapitated stones, they're all about Istanbul, except one. There's one Wilkinson, I think, who visits Montenegro and Bosnia, I think, and reports of the same phenomenon there. But again, you know, it's not really the kind of quantifiable and representative data that you can use. But I would agree with you, first of all, that this is mostly a central phenomenon. And as I always say about the Ottoman Empire is extremely centralized at the center, not in the rest of the empire. So yes, again, would that explain a time lag of almost 10 years between the events and the first stone decapitations? I don't know. I mean, I really don't have an answer. And why wouldn't there be a single document in the Ottoman archives that talks about that mentions, you know, the breaking of stones? I have no answer to that either. But yes, obviously, and I think one of the problems is that Ottoman documentation is extremely limited in its tendency to basically reveal the vision of the state, which is always either very normative or wishful thinking. And therefore, you have to read between the lines to get a sense of what is really happening in the provinces. But there are pieces of information I've found in Ottoman archives that tells you, for example, that Kahveci, a coffee house owner in Izmit, I think, still had the insignia of the Janissaries on top of it, and he was executed because of that. So, and in the French reports, I mean, there's one report that says that in some godforsaken area of Eastern Anatolia, it's a travelogue, and the guy says, our host, he visits some kind of a home, and the guy says, now that the Janissaries are gone, who is going to protect us from the despotism of the local governor and whatever? So you get a sense that the Janissaries are playing. I'm not a fan of the idea of equating the Janissaries with some kind of a civil society or a bourgeoisie or whatever, but it's somewhere in between. They are some kind of a buffer between the authority because they're totally immersed in a society. There's an interesting comment, which I didn't show, about Hussein Aga Pasha roaming Constantinople, catching people and asking them, are you Janissary or are you Muslim? I mean, even that is already interesting. And some insist on responding, I'm Janissary, and they're decapitated. So, you know, it's very interesting. But again, I haven't really worked enough on this but I think we need so much research on the event, on Mahmud. I mean, we don't have a proper biography of Mahmud. And what I discover about Mahmud's playing binbaşı, playing colonel, it's fascinating. And it's nowhere to be found in the Ottoman archives. So there's a whole character there. Other stories, I've recently published a report by a French observer of a feast in Kağıthane in 1833, where the entire Sublime Porte drink each other under the table in presence of the corps diplomatique, of the diplomats. And they're trying to, this is very typical of Mahmud, showing that drinking is the way to be modern. In vino modernitas is what I call this article. It's a fascinating report. Nothing in the Ottoman sources, obviously. Although you have a report on that feast in the Takvim-i-Vekai. So it's interesting to compare the two versions, totally different. So there's so much to do on Mahmud, on the Janissary issue. And, you know, you cannot help but draw a parallel, which is extremely difficult, dangerous, between that event and what's happening today in Turkey with the Fethullah too. You know, I mean, the way in which the Gülenists are attacked, it's so much like, you know, the condemnation and demonization of the Janissaries. I'm not saying that the Gülenists are good guys, but, you know, the rhetoric is the same. And that's appalling.
Thanks a lot. It was amazing. Oh. Thank you. So, do we have any indications or facts about the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi involvement in the destruction of the Janissary too? Because like some historians like Abu Maneh argues that the evolution of Janissary is not only related to the new army, but also related to the their outrage towards the Naqshbandis, Mujaddidis. And like the same thing happen to the Bektashi too? And if so, actually my question, like in case that, if so, which brings us the question of religious sectarian propaganda, not only like the propaganda from the central state, like propaganda towards the Sultan, but these religious propaganda, if these also comes to the scene, we cannot align whatever happened directly and very easily with the modernization. There's another contradiction here. So since in the Ottoman historiography, we always tend to align everything, whatever happened in the 19th century with that. But if the Naqshbandi involvement is there?
They're going to ask you for the mask. Yeah, it muffles your voice. Yeah.
Shall I repeat?
I think it would. I mean, I heard perfectly, but yeah.
Okay, no, that was
Okay. Well, that's a terrible question because it gives me the occasion to give one of my long answers. Because I've just published an article on not 1826, but 1839 and Abu Maneh's claim that 1839, the Tanzimat, was the making of the Mujaddidi Naqshbandi tariqat, which I completely disagree with. I mean, my whole article, it's going to be out in Josika, is to disprove this thing. But that being said, I think there is some wisdom to this question of the religious legitimation, justification, and rhetoric of some of the movements of the time. And I think it would work much better with 1826 than with 1839. Again, I haven't seen anything, but I mean, the 1820s is really a time when the Mujaddidi movement is extremely powerful. And with, of course, problems with Mahmud. I mean, Mahmud and the Mujaddidis are not really friends during that period because it's something that may limit his power. So his absolutism is threatened and challenged by the Mujaddidi movement. But as you said, the combination of Janissary, Bektashi on the one side, heterodoxy if you want, and then Mujaddidi, Naqshbandi orthodoxy on the other side, makes me think that yes, and when you see Hussein Agha Pasha going, are you a Muslim or a Janissary? I mean, that's exactly orthodoxy being applied to a situation where the Janissaries are counted as heterodox and heretics and whatever. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, not in 1839, but in 1826. But then again, one would have to seriously work, because the problem of Abu Maneh is that he's got very good ideas, but he didn't have the proof that connects these events. And you need some proof. I mean, even if it is speculative. So just saying that the mother of Abdul-Mejid was made a donation to the Naqshbandi convent is not enough to decide that the whole entourage of Abdul-Mejid was Naqshbandi. But for 1826, I think much work needs to be done outside perhaps of the state archives into the order's own archives and writings. I don't know, but I think it's an excellent initiative. It would be an excellent initiative to try to understand this from the perspective of religion, because obviously Mahmud is using religion, the Sanjak Sharif, everything, all the symbolism of religion, even though he himself is going for a much more secular, authoritarian, and despotic rule. He is building his autocracy. But then again, he is using religion, and I'm pretty sure that his entourage is doing so also. And there's no way the Naqshbandis wouldn't have taken advantage of this situation in order to promote their own position in the system.
Thank you again. And your answer also made me thought about, because during your presentation in the beginning of the tombstone section, you mentioned about the Necdet İşler.
İşli.
And these general idea and belief about the tombs actually based on discourse, not the facts. And this is an historiographical, the pitfall of Ottoman historiography. We see a lot. And for Ebu Maneh, your criticism also align with that, because discourse over the facts.
Yes. Yes, that's always a problem in Ottoman history, unfortunately. I mean, there is so much quote unquote factual information that is based on just rhetoric, discourse. And when you dig a little bit, when you scratch the surface, you discover that there's absolutely nothing beneath it. And it's fascinating because it's so frustrating. But in a sense, it's interesting because it gives you a lot of work to do. I mean, I'm at the end of a career, but for you guys, it's good news because, I mean, every day is a new discovery of things that were badly done, badly documented, and need to be done from scratch.
There is a comment rather than a question of the Zoom, by Mehmet Mert Sunar, who says that very interesting findings, a very similar couplet, the couplet about the janissary like mushrooms. Yeah. You saw the beginning from a janissary Yafta. This is threatening Mahmud after the Alemdar incident, so before the destruction of the Janissaries. Seni eder ragmendan beter janissary tukinmez mantar kibi yeder biter. This from Jabit Arehi.
And what's the source of that? But I know Mehmet Mert Sunar.
Jabit Arehi.
In Jabi?
Yeah, the Chronicles of Jabi.
Wow, but Jabi finishes in 1812. Jabi's narrative.
But this from the Alemdar incident.
Sorry?
This is from the Alemdar incident, not from the...
Oh, from the Alemdar incident.
So
but already attacking Mahmud.
Yeah. And with the same, I mean, he used the same metaphor. Now it's
the mantar gibi bitmek and whatever.
So it seems
that's fascinating. So it's almost 20 years earlier, well, 10, 15 years earlier, the same couple. That's very interesting. Thank you, Mert.
There's no other question. I was, as you may imagine, fascinated by your discussion of the vampire incident, which, yes, it's not unknown. I mean, it's mentioned by Roberto Taelli already, and okay, I had the idea that this was a real fact. I mean, no, it is because it is repeating descriptions of vampirism and it's how they dealt with it from earlier eras. Now I'm a bit more convinced after our discussion and what the French source said about it, that it was a piece of propaganda, which also makes me wonder about, okay, again, I have only questions and perhaps we don't have answers. I mean, okay, we may assume that this was not a real event. I mean, not a real, yeah, okay, whatever. So it was either invented by the Takvim Vekai, like an imaginary report from Tirnova, or was it instigated by, I mean, invented by the Naib of Tirnova? And then if it was so, because it shows a knowledge of local traditions, as we may know. So was this invented by the Naib upon some instigation, upon some orders from the central government, or what was it a sign of goodwill to show that he was so much, I mean, supporting Mahmud's policies? So the mechanisms, this propaganda of this decentralized propaganda was produced is a question.
Okay.
I don't expect an answer.
I do have one. I mean, it's going to be an incomplete and speculative answer, but first of all, I think this is inscribed in a larger context of Keramet, of Mahmud's Keramet, which is central to his image building in the Takvim Vekai. Keramet is divination, if you want, or it is some kind of an extraordinary power of knowing and wisdom, which you see repeated in many cases. And there's one other case, which I have studied, which is very similar, because it concerns a drought in Thessaloniki in 1832, I think. So more or less the same years. And I saw the Naib's Ilam in the archives. And the Naib's Ilam says basically that there was this terrible drought in Thessaloniki. Everybody was dying of hunger and there was no rain. And one guy, can't remember his name, who came from Istanbul, claimed that he had seen Mahmud in his dream and that Mahmud had told him to go to the Hagia Sophia of Thessaloniki and to, I can't remember what it was, touch whatever stone with a stick and whatever, and that it would rain. So he says that, and they do that the following day, and of course, it rains. And what's much more interesting, and this I owe to Murat Çiviloğlu, whom I quoted because he's working on, there are two people who are working on this keramet business and linking it to the Takvim Vekai. One is Murat Çiviloğlu, who's now in Dublin. The other is Özgür Türesay, who is in Paris. And Murat Çiviloğlu told me that he had found in the Takvim Vekai the exact same text as the Ilam of the Naib of Salonika concerning the miracle of Hagia Sophia. And I'm trying to remember now, I think, and I looked for it in the online catalog, but couldn't find it. But sometimes, you know, they can be classified in weird ways. I wouldn't be surprised to find the Naib of Turnovo in the Ottoman archives. Now, the question is, how does this work? Is it Istanbul saying, okay, let's prepare a keramet story and assigns this role to one naib in whatever province, Is it the initiative? I would kind of be inclined into thinking that this is centrally planned, and that therefore this is part of a propaganda machine which the state, which Mahmud is organizing in order to promote this vision of the wise and all-knowing sultan who can even interfere with magic. And therefore, I have another evidence that goes in the same direction, which is what I mentioned at the very end when I said that there was this French report of a reception in Kağıthane where all the Turks were drinking themselves silly throughout the, and then I said there was the same, because I mean, it wasn't just a feast, it was also the exercise and drill of the artillery and whatever in Kağıthane. So it was a show for the corps diplomatique of the new efficiency of the army and whatever. So you do have a report in the Takvim-i The report is very parallel when it comes to the military exercise. There is no mention of the drinking, obviously. There is a common mention of the show of acrobats. And then there is in the Turkish version something that is not in the French version, which is again a keramet story, because when returning from Kağıthane, the Sultan, when he arrives at Tophane, is suddenly faced with the cries of a young woman who says, "Save me, O Sultan, save me. They're kidnapping me to take me to the islands." And it turns out she is a survivor of the Chios massacre who was, quote unquote, adopted by a good Muslim, was then married off to a good Muslim, was already the mother of a 6-year-old child or whatever, and her father from Chios kidnaps her, tricks her into believing that her mother wants to see her, and puts her on a boat, has her wear a Greek garment, and that's when the Sultan intervenes and saves her from this kidnapping by her own father and whatever. So again, a keramet story in the Takvim-i, because a keramet there is not so much the discovery of this kidnapping, but the fact that the guy, again, Nicola, I think. I mean, half of the Greeks are named Nicola in the Takvim-i. The Greek tries to escape the justice of the vengeance of the Sultan, and he dies of a mysterious illness in his own home. And they discover his body, and of course, it's keramet and whatever. So I think there's a whole thing there. There's a whole building up of the keramet of the Sultan, of the wisdom of the Sultan, of the powers of the Sultan, of which these are individual examples. In this case, I think there is an overlap between the desire to, again, feed this execration, condemnation of the Janissaries with, again, the keramet of the Sultan, because the Sultan is you can see it here, you know, the benevolent hands of His Majesty, the shade of God on earth and whatever. He's everywhere in the story. So I think it's a propaganda machine that is working, and which I hope Özgür Turesai and Murat Çiviloğlu will reveal in all its complexity.
Yes, I would like, of course, to thank you for a fascinating lecture, and I'm extremely happy that you started the lectures in IMS with physical presence after 2 years. We're very excited, a little bit numb, you know, we don't know what to do. We have also built a whole sort of apparatus next door to have Zoom, and from this position, I send regards to Princeton and Professor Anastasopoulos, who's with us. and many others. So I just wanted to say, just make a comment that I found also amazing, the comparison you made from the perception of the West, of course, and art, and the comparison between the massacre of Chios and as well the slaughtering of all Janissaries and so on. So that gives a larger picture, and this is
Well, thank you. Again, a larger but very weird picture. I mean, I don't know what to do with it. I mean,
yes.
I'm not going to say something about Ottoman history on the basis of the similarities between two European paintings, but what I insist on is the need to look beyond our little world, our little parochial world, and see that there are repercussions and inspirations beyond, and that they work in both directions.
We just did that, yeah. So it's wonderful, yes, to put ideas out and also put questions.
I just wanted to add to this, something to this, because I found fascinating the idea that the Janissaries were depicted in the paintings as the innocent, right? It's like a very liberal depiction of the Janissaries, although we all know that it was not exactly that could describe them. Some people might have been like this, but we cannot exactly know. Also, what is interesting in that respect is the Irz expression in Hussein Pasha's portrait. So, you know, like one thing that struck to me when you were talking about this was that, like, in so many rebellions that I've seen in the sources of Janissaries, they all are always being accused of attacking the Ehli Irz. All right, so who would be like the innocent, honorable, honest, good people. For me, maybe there is some kind of a connection there, because you have so many descriptions in like imperial orders saying that these brigands, these, you know, like bandits are actually attacking this type of Muslim. All right, so maybe it's exactly because of all these incidents that have been happening for years, hundreds and hundreds all around the empire. And of course, the Imperial Center has constructed a certain vocabulary that was using for all of these instances. And of course, this was like the of the Janissaries. I'm sure he had signed a lot of those, right? So he had participated in many of these Mejlisi Shura, you know, like this big imperial councils where they would discuss that. So I guess maybe there's a connection there. And also it's interesting to see how, you know, like the French, Delacroix and Chamartin, they would, you know, like depict the Janissaries as the innocents, but this guy there says the exact opposite. So yes, it was just a comment.
Yes, I mean, Chamartin's painting is one of victimization of the Janissaries, but this is very elogious of Hussein Pasha. So it's ambiguous. It's, I don't know where exactly, I mean, again, is Chamartin really putting his liberal and anti-royalist, anti-Charles X sentiments forward in the painting, and here doing something more local, depicting an individual he admired because of his incredible career. But otherwise, yes, I agree with you. I mean, Ehli Urz, it makes sense contextually, but textually, this is weird. This is a weird construction of a portrait. It's not French, it's not Ottoman. I'm not talking about the portrait itself. I'm talking about this inclusion of the little vignettes with, and this is what really, I cannot imagine the French guy inventing this, because if he had, he would have had something in French, some kind of a correspondence, but no, this is something I think that was pretty much an idea of Hussein Pasha himself. So it's very interesting from that perspective. But otherwise, yes. I mean, the Janissaries are Ishkiya. You have a series of epithets that define them, which are all negative, and they are all about being vandals and killers and attackers of all the values, including urz, namus, you know. So it makes sense. But here, and especially next to Han, between Han and Afan, it's weird. That's the only thing I'm saying. Contextually, it works. Textually, it's a fascinating document, which I cannot fully explain, which I would love to be able to explain better, but you know, again, it's not always possible.
See, there is no further question or comment, and it's already way past 10. I think we can thank again Professor Eldem, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you. I mean, it was my pleasure to be able to address both Janet and Ghost in the same lecture. Come on, I mean, you know, I was only missing a ship in the whole story, but you know, that'll come later. Thank you.